Welcome to Kronos Talks, where we explore an issue of the day and provide some candid thoughts on what might need to change if we're going to get the worlds of sustainable finance and corporate sustainability to generate positive impacts. I'm Nikki Amos, Managing Director at Kronos, and I'm joined by our Head of Biodiversity and Nature, Gemma James.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Gemma. So, Gemma, it's October. COP16 Biodiversity Summit in Colombia is happening this month. This recording is being done ahead of the summit, so we can't really reflect on what comes out of that summit. We've also got COP29 Climate Convention happening in Azerbaijan in November. So lots happening in the climate space, in the biodiversity space. But we're really interested to understand, with all of this focus on transition planning, whether nature actually features as part of those plans. So today we're discussing whether or not companies are thinking about nature, getting organised around nature, and considering nature as part of their climate mitigation and adaptation strategies.
Should we explain what climate transition plans are first, Nikki?
Probably a good place to start, actually, yes. So what do we mean by a climate transition plan? Well, it's a strategic plan that outlines how a company is going to adapt its business model and its operations to respond to the risks and opportunities of transitioning to a low carbon economy. A transition plan needs to be robust, it needs to be measurable, and it needs to be aligned with Paris climate goals to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. So it feels very much like we've reached a tipping point on climate transition plans. But what about nature? With all the focus on transition planning, why should companies consider nature as part of these plans, Gemma?
There's lots of reasons why companies should consider nature in their transition plan. So the first thing to note is climate change and nature are deeply entwined. You just can't solve one without the other or considering the other. Climate change is a driver of nature loss, and nature is a significant carbon sink, so therefore it can actually contribute to climate mitigation. So protecting and avoiding negative impacts on natural sinks means that carbon sinks would actually retain their capacity. The reverse then is also true. So the loss of nature is a climate change driver. So removal or weakening of a natural sink. So if we take deforestation as an example, that removes the sequestration capacity and actually releases more greenhouse gas emissions. And then the final point to make here is that nature also has a role in adaptation and resilience. So enhancing ecosystem integrity, that can actually lessen the impacts of climate change. And that needs to be planned correctly, of course. So if you've got a natural river system or a wetland or, upstream forest ecosystems, that can help reduce flood risk, for example, by storing more water and slowing that water flow.
Given that synergy between climate and nature, couldn't it be argued that companies' transition plans will result in benefits to nature de facto?
Not necessarily. So the other thing we should also consider is that lots of decarbonisation activities could actually contribute to nature loss. So really here we're talking about trade-offs. So if we think about the supply chain for all the minerals and metals that we need for our transition to a low carbon economy, so we're thinking about renewable energy tech, we're talking about electric vehicles, what's the impact of nature on increased extraction and the processing of those minerals and metals? And the same with things like afforestation and restoration projects for offsetting. So if you have inappropriate species or monocultures or non-native trees that are being planted, you actually increase the risk and introduce invasive species. And also you could increase land degradation over the long term, and that compromises resilience overall.
So the rationale seems compelling, but are companies really taking this seriously?
There are a few companies doing this, but it's not at scale. So there's some fundamental things that companies will need to be on top of in terms of getting to grips with nature in the first place. So we have to remember nature's a nascent topic, so just integrating it into a climate transition plan is not as easy as it sounds. But there is some guidance that's being developed. So earlier this year, the Nature Working Group of the Transition Planning Task Force published an advisory paper on how transition planning planning could effectively be applied to nature. And the other point to note here is that we've actually, as Kronos, we've been speaking to a number of companies on climate physical risk. And actually, they're very focused on net zero and decarbonisation. And they're not necessarily thinking about, say, adaptation and then the role of nature in their adaptation strategies. And this has not been systematically integrated into their overall climate strategy. So what you end up with is this really disjointed approach where your decarbonisation activities might be having an impact on nature. You don't know that it's happening. You end up with some unintended consequences, and it actually might be counterproductive to your mitigation activities and your adaptation strategy in the long term.
You mentioned some really useful resources there, Gemma, so we'll provide some links with the accompanying podcast blog. So I'm glad you mentioned the disjointed approach, because it seems that policymakers are treating nature and climate separately. You know, we've got COP16 on biodiversity and we've got COP29 on climate. Both, of course, are critical for long-term sustainability. And we understand that they need to work together. But the policymakers are treating them in separate buckets. Do you see a time when the two COPs could come together?
So in the long term, yes. We want to see joint policy frameworks and decisions being made together so that one is accounting for the other, and that's for us to identify those synergies and trade-offs. However, in the short term, nature is such a nascent topic in comparison to climate, who's had decades to be able to have these conversations, have thought leadership, discuss, find consensus, and nature hasn't had that yet. So actually it needs its own space to be able to go through that same process.
Fair enough, but we don't have 30 years to get our heads around nature. We need to act now.
It's a very good point. And the discussions around nature are very intense right now. So if you look at the speed that TNFD has been developed, it just shows that the momentum is on for nature, and lots of different stakeholders are coming together to find what does a nature positive pathway look like.
So do you see a time, Gemma, when reporting frameworks will come together? So TCFD, TNFD, would that make sense from a holistic reporting perspective?
Yeah, so I think from a company perspective, it makes great sense. A number of the companies that we've spoken to have actually talked about how they would like to see integrated TCFD and TNFD reporting in the future. They're at different stages, though, of maturity at this point. But actually, if you look at their structure, TNFD is very much based on TCFD. So actually having them together would make sense. Maybe also just to make the point in general, we're talking about integrating nature into climate transition planning, and we have to just note that it's not a replacement for having a dedicated plan for nature as well. And that includes the reporting that goes with it. So it's all about finding trade-offs and synergies between nature and climate. They will require separate types of metrics and indicators, but one is not replacing the other.
And there aren't any shortcuts, really.
No.
Respecting what you're saying.
No, I'm afraid you have to do the work, and you have to understand nature in its own right to know how it interlinks and affects climate as well.
So we work with lots of corporate clients. Companies respond, in our experience, to clearly outlined expectations by investors, customers, regulators, NGOs. But companies also want, and I think need to see what good looks like. Can you give us some examples?
Yep, absolutely. So there's two examples that come to mind. So one is Danone. They have a really comprehensive regenerative agriculture program and a commitment to deforestation and conversion-free supply chains as part of their transition plan. And Nestle, they also have a regenerative agriculture program and a forest strategy, both of which are referenced and mentioned in their transition plan, as well as the use of natural climate solutions. So you can see with those two companies, they're making the connection between the two issues on their regenerative agriculture programs. The nice thing is that they're both set up to show continuous improvement with the farmers that they have. So they have their own measurement systems where farmers do need to meet a certain criteria, and they actually lay out and define what they mean by regenerative agriculture, what kind of practices they expect. But then they have this continuous improvement. So they bring the farmers on a journey with them. So they don't just say, sorry, this is regenerative agriculture. You can't be one of our farmers because you don't meet these thresholds. But here are a number of different levels for you to work through in order to meet what we would define as regenerative agriculture. And then they will measure the impacts of that through productivity, yield, farmer resilience, and, a lot of the economic benefits, as well as, how the environment is actually changing as well. So I think they're really nice examples. Both companies are very open in their disclosures. So they have the scorecards online on their websites. Everything is actually very accessible for you to read up on their approach, their intention, the objectives, the process that they are taking forward with the farmers. And Danone actually have some case studies which actually have the results from those specific pilots as well.
I think we have to acknowledge that we're in an experimentation phase. There should be lots of innovation, as we're seeing with Danone and Nestle, which all helps to build knowledge and understanding of the issue. But it also highlights how complex the issue is as well. So we're some way off from probably being able to demonstrate performance impacts from all of this work. But the thinking is there, the processes are in place, and it's being shared transparently, which can only be a good thing in terms of spurring other companies to be adopting a similar mindset.
Yeah, precisely. And a lot of the other companies we've talked to that are now in pilot stage with regenerative agriculture, they are using this as a learning, and then they're using the learnings to scale through the rest of their organisation. So yeah, you're right. And it'll take time before we see the results. Like nature doesn't literally grow overnight. I mean, it doesn't grow overnight, but there will be a time lag in terms of seeing certain results and outcomes depending on what you're looking to measure.
Aside from these good practice examples, where can companies go for guidance?
So actually there's a WWF report which was released in 2023. So actually we at Kronos, we conducted research for this guide.
I remember.
And the guide looks at how to integrate nature goals into transition plans. And it lists a number of different existing tools which are available for companies to use to help them with that integration, so to get started. And then the other example is the TPT guide, which I mentioned earlier as well.
Let's get to the basics. What simple advice can we give to companies to help them get started?
So 3 things.
Okay.
So the first one would be to take a staged approach. You just can't achieve full integration and get to nature positive and transition plans straight away. It's going to take time. You might have big ambitions, that's great, but it's actually really good to go through a process, see what the results tell you, as that's going to inform your next steps. The second thing is around assessing impacts and dependencies. And I would say the biggest tip here is to remember that this is going to be an iterative process. You'll need to refine your data over time, collect it, measure it. And then the data is not always going to be perfect, but it's okay to use proxies. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is to actually prioritise and set your scope and boundaries. So you don't have to do impacts and dependencies for the whole company to start with. You could scale this down. You could look at a specific commodity, a specific part of your business or specific region, but just start small and then scale.
How is regulation going to help to move the dial on nature?
Mm-hmm. Good question. From what we've heard, so we've been talking to a couple of companies and they've told us that their focus is very much on CSRD, given that it's mandatory and therefore it's priority. Some companies, obviously not all companies, are actually putting TNFD on the back burner. It's not a priority for them because of CSRD. And I think we just have to look at the differences between the likes of CSRD and TNFD. So, there's going to be differences in semantics and the granularity. And for TNFD, for example, they also have additional guidance for some sectors. And that guidance is still under consultation in some cases. TNFD tends to be slightly more granular. The ESRS standard that underpins the CSRD is broader. And it's probably harder for companies to actually interpret because it's not so specific. And we actually found, because we did the work on the metrics for the TNFD mining sector supplement, we found that it's actually easier for companies to have more defined and specific indicators because there is less room for interpretation with those. But I think both CSRD and the likes of TNFD, they recognise that there's a process that companies have to go through when they're looking at nature. So companies have to go through a journey to set baselines, measure, monitor, track, disclose the data, and then what are their actions going to look like? They have to do a materiality assessment. You're not going to see the term nature in CSRD as such, but you will see water, air quality, pollution, waste. And these are obviously all linked together.
And of course, there are issues that companies have been managing for years anyway. They don't necessarily categorise them under nature, but they are issues that they will be very familiar with.
Yep, so it's nothing new for them, really.
No, it's just a reframing, really, isn't it?
And disclosure frameworks are vehicles to standardise the approach to show how companies are actually going to mitigate their impacts, and also to show how prepared and resilient they're going to be to any changes which are coming, be they regulatory, climate or transition risks.
Gemma, do you have any closing thoughts on which sectors should be thinking about nature?
I think irrespective of which sector companies are in, everyone is going to be exposed to climate and nature risks, and whether that's directly or within your supply chains. So if you think about it, everything on this earth is either mined or grown. So food and agriculture have an obvious dependency on nature. But when you think about sectors like technology, buildings, automobiles, they all rely on mining in their supply chains, which can also have impacts on climate and be exposed to climate impacts and also nature as well. All sectors need to be really aware of climate and nature, the interrelation between them, and then what the impacts are to them and how they are impacting climate and nature.
So I suppose if I were to sum up what I think we've been talking about, the first is that more than 6,000 companies have published a transition plan, and that number's likely to double in the next year. So it does really feel like we've reached a tipping point on transition planning. So it feels an obvious time for companies to be integrating nature into those transition plans, or to at least begin that process of integration. We've currently got lots of siloed thinking on both climate and nature needs. And of course, over time, we expect them to become more integrated so that the synergies and the trade-offs that you mentioned can be determined and managed effectively. So essentially, we need this if we're going to achieve global environmental goals. But let's be clear, we don't have decades for companies to get up to speed on nature. It's concerning that they're putting nature on the back burner. The time really to act is now. And there are three main drivers for that. First being regulation. We mentioned CSRD. This applies to all companies across all sectors of a certain size, and it's designed to ensure that companies have proper oversight of sustainability issues and disclosures and accountability, which of course has to include nature. And it also enables companies to reframe what they understand to be issues around water, air quality, waste under the nature banner, which will be really helpful in terms of a step forward. Encouragingly, good practice does exist. We've heard about the examples from Nestlé and Danone, and many companies will benefit from their leadership and their innovation in this space. And we're seeing more expectations being placed on companies by investors and other stakeholders on nature, with an expectation that companies will report on TNFD alongside the mandatory reporting frameworks such as CSRD. So where do we go from here? Well, there's help available. Kronos can certainly help companies understand all of these differing expectations of stakeholders, from investors to NGOs, and really help companies, at least at a basic level, prepare for mandatory due diligence and reporting requirements. But, beyond that, we can help companies ensure business resilience through assessing their risks and their opportunities presented by nature. Do you think that's a reasonable summary of what we've discussed?
Yeah, I think so. I think that wraps it up really nicely. And we're really looking forward to doing more interesting projects with clients. We've had such a variety across different sectors, looking at risks and opportunities and reporting and disclosure. So we're kind of, excited for what comes next for the team.
Thanks so much, Gemma.
Thanks, Nikki.
Enjoyed talking to you today. So do please keep an eye on the Chronos LinkedIn feed for more updates from us and future episodes of Chronos Talks. You can follow us on Spotify and via our YouTube channel.